Alright, ladies and gentlemen, in today's video we're going to talk a little bit about the classification of organisms. Now this isn't a topic that we're going to focus on heavily, just a couple of basic ideas that we want to make sure that we understand moving forward. So we've also already talked about how scientists really want to understand how we decide what is life and what is not. Sort of implicitly, you all understand that a rock is alive and a human, or is not alive, and a human being is alive. But as a scientist, we need to be able to explain why, and that explanation needs to be able to apply to a whole multitude of things. And we've recently gone through all those characteristics and what they mean, and we've even been doing experiments to sort of explore those. But once we know that something is alive, scientists like to understand the relationships between different living things. Because if we can understand those relationships, they can tell us a lot about the biochemical aspects of living things, about evolutionary aspects in terms of how organisms are able to adapt to different environments, and it can tell us a lot about the history of life on Earth, seeing how we've gone from one individual living thing to a multitude of diverse living things, and why some things have gone away and why others have stayed. And understanding all those relationships can really help us understand how living things and why living things are and behave the way they do. So what happens is, when cataloging these connections and trying to figure out the relationships between living things, what we do is we create groupings. And those groupings tend to be based upon similarities. We tend to base groupings on things that organisms share. Now, occasionally, when creating these groupings upon similarities, we will also exclude organisms based on differences. And we actually talked a little bit about this in class, discussing things like synamorphies and automorphies, things that only individual organisms have versus things that multiple organisms have. And we like to do that just so we can start to decide, all right, well, these organisms all have similar structures. They belong together. But this organism, which has similar structures but doesn't have this one thing, that maybe we'll leave alone. Or this organism that has similar structures but has one thing that's different than all the rest, maybe that we take out as well. And it's just the way that we go about starting to classify things. So in class we actually discussed a structure that's very similar to what you'd call a tree of life, called a cladogram. And a cladogram uses what we would say as shared characteristics. And we actually use the word derived because a cladogram is a very close relationship to the idea of evolution. So we would have these shared characteristics and we would use them to create a tree where it's like, oh, well, these organisms share, this organism does not. These organisms share, this organism does not. And we've seen a couple of good examples of that, when we were going over a few things in class. You would have an organism up here on the cladogram, and down here you would have a trait. And what we are saying is everything above that trait, every organism we list, has that trait. So if I were to put another trait right here, what I'm saying is every organism above that has the trait and every organism below it does not. And that's sort of how a cladogram works. Well, the logical extension of these individual cladograms with small groups of organisms is a giant family tree for all living things. And you start to create the branches of the tree based upon traits that organisms share or do not share. And eventually what this does is this leads to this tree we have here, which includes our domains. So you see here, this is the domain bacteria, or what's generally referred to as eubacteria, because they are modern, more evolutionarily advanced bacteria. Over here, you have the archaea, or the archaebacteria, which are the real few bacteria that still exist that are based upon very old, ancient organisms. And these tend to be those extremophiles we discussed, the organisms that only exist in extreme environments, such as at hydrothermal vents or, situations like that. They're very specialized and so very limited in where they live. And then up here, you have the domain eukarya. And that is all the eukaryotic cells that exist in living things, which is a lot of what you consider when you think about the kingdoms. You could see over here, Animalia, here, kingdom fungi, here, actually probably more around here, because you can see the plants, the algae. This is probably kingdom Plantae. And then the last one, because it's Animalia, Plantae, fungi, and etc. What's important to me is not so much that you remember domains, kingdoms, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Although this, genus and species, will become important much later, because this is how we name organisms. For instance, human beings are Homo sapien, and house cat is Felis domesticus. So it's just important that you understand that, like, every organism has a scientific name that is actually its genus and species. But recently, the last 30 or so years, scientists decided that going by this, like, rigid kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species as the sole and majority way we classify organisms is less instructive than a diagram like you see here on the page, where what we're doing is we're tracking their evolutionary history and showing how one organism changed to eventually become another. And so that's what the majority of modern classification is. Now, the thing of it is, when we're creating diagrams like this, we need to think about what evidence we're using to place organisms in their various positions. And so what we do is we look at a couple of things. First off, we might look at morphology, which is physical characteristics. So, the way that a human being has a spinal column compared to a chimpanzee's spinal column. Or in the example of whales, how their spine and back movement is similar to dogs and other land mammals as opposed to fish. We also look at behaviors. This tends to be something more common for more advanced organisms, because while behaviors themselves aren't necessarily a evolutionary adaptation, instead what happens is, for behaviors to exist, there have to be certain physical structures or mental structures within the organism's brain and nervous system to allow the behavior to occur. And so sometimes those nervous system structures become very narrow and very specific, and they get passed on from organism to organism. A great example is imprinting. If you've ever heard that story about how, like, baby ducks think the first thing they see is their parent, and also certain types of behavioral conditioning that you can do on certain animals like dogs, or why dogs are so loyal to humans. Those are all physical structures within the organism's brain that allow that behavior to happen very simply and consistently, and those evolutionary structures are selected for so that the organism can continue to show that behavior. Similar things happen to human beings and primates and stuff like that. So we do tend to look at morphology and behaviors when attempting to classify these organisms. But at its heart, the single most important thing that we look at is an organism's genetics. Because an organism's genetics will give it its morphology. An organism's genetics will give it its behaviors. And its genetics are controlled by a special molecule found in every cell of an organism. I bet you're trying to guess right now exactly what that molecule is. I know you've heard of it. And it's DNA. The most fascinating thing about DNA is that every single living organism, every single one, has DNA. And every single living organism uses it practically the same way. And DNA, while present in every organism, still has the capability to provide the unique differences from organism to organism. And that's what we're going to discuss in our next unit, DNA and other important molecules to living things. All right, ladies and gentlemen, there's some basics on classification.